Detective Rick Marsden leaned back in his chair at the precinct, letting out a long sigh. His boots rested on the corner of his cluttered desk, and he sipped lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug that read, "World's Okayest Cop." It wasn't much of an office, just a small room with peeling paint, fluorescent lights flickering above, and stacks of files piled haphazardly everywhere. But it was home to him, or at least as close to one as he had these days. Across the desk sat Ethan Cole, a wiry man in his mid-30s with grease-streaked hands and tired eyes. He looked uncomfortable, like someone who didn't belong in this world of badges and uniforms. His baseball cap was twisted nervously between his fingers, and his voice wavered slightly as he spoke. "I'm telling you," Ethan said, leaning forward, "it's not just my imagination. These guys, they've been following me for weeks now. Weird vans parked outside my garage late at night, shadowy figures watching me when I leave work. And then there are those notes." He pulled crumpled pieces of paper from his pocket and slid them across the desk toward Rick. Rick picked up the scraps without much interest. They were scribbled messages, barely legible, warning Ethan to stay quiet or face consequences. 1. Note read, "Stop asking questions if you value your life." Another simply said, "You don't know what you're dealing with." Rick raised an eyebrow but couldn't help chuckling under his breath. "Look, buddy," he said, setting the notes down. "I get it. You're scared. But come on. Shadowy figures, cryptic messages, sounds like something straight out of a bad action movie." Ethan frowned, clearly frustrated. "I'm serious. Detective, something weird is going on here. I think they might be special forces or something." That did it. Rick burst into laughter, slapping his knee like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. "Special forces? Ha 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 ha. Oh man, you've been watching way too many spy flicks, haven't you?" He wiped a tear from the corner of his eye, still grinning. But Ethan wasn't laughing. His jaw tightened and his knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the table. "This isn't a joke," he snapped. "I may not wear a badge or carry a gun, but I know when something feels wrong, and this feels very, very wrong." For a moment, Rick stopped smiling. There was something in Ethan's voice, a raw honesty that cut through the sarcasm. Still, he shook his head. All right, he said, holding up his hands. "Let's say I believe you. What exactly do you want me to do about it?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "Just look into it, please. I don't have anyone else to turn to." Rick sighed, rubbing the stubble on his chin. He wanted to dismiss Ethan outright, chalk it up to paranoia or overactive imagination, but something nagged at him. A tiny itch in the back of his mind telling him maybe, just maybe, this guy wasn't completely off base. "Fine," Rick muttered reluctantly. "I'll check it out. But don't expect miracles, okay? My plate's already full with drunk drivers and shoplifters." Ethan nodded gratefully, standing up to leave. As he walked out of the precinct, Rick watched him go, shaking his head. "Special forces," he muttered to himself, snorting again. Yeah, right. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just laughed off something far bigger than either of them realized. Outside, Ethan climbed into his beat-up truck, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He glanced around nervously, half expecting to see another black van idling nearby. For weeks he'd felt like prey in some invisible game he didn't understand. Now even the cop who was supposed to help thought he was crazy. As he drove away, Ethan clenched his teeth. Whether Rick believed him or not, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening wasn't going to stop on its own. And if no one else was willing to step up, then it was up to him to figure it out, even if it meant putting himself in danger. Little did he, or Rick, know, the events set in motion would spiral far beyond anything they could have imagined. What started as a laughable claim would soon reveal itself to be the beginning of a fight for survival, and the birth of an unlikely hero. Ethan pulled into the driveway of his modest auto repair shop, the same place he'd called home for the past decade. The neon sign above the garage flickered weakly. Cole's Auto Repair, casting a pale glow over the cracked asphalt. It wasn't much, but it was his sanctuary, the one thing in life he could count on. At least, that's what he thought until now. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world cloaked in shadows. Ethan parked his truck and stepped out, scanning the area cautiously. His heart pounded as he glanced at the darkened woods surrounding the property. There was nothing unusual, at least not at first glance. But the feeling of being watched lingered, like an itch he couldn't scratch. He shook his head, trying to push the paranoia aside. "Get a grip," he muttered under his breath. Still, he made sure to lock the gate behind him before heading inside. The garage smelled of oil, rust, and rubber, familiar scents that usually brought him comfort. Tonight, though, they felt suffocating. Ethan flipped on the overhead lights, their harsh brightness cutting through the gloom. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work, determined to distract himself by tinkering with an old sedan that had been sitting in the corner for weeks. As he leaned over the engine bay, tools clinking softly, he tried to convince himself that everything was fine, that the strange notes and the eerie sense of being followed were all in his head. But then it happened. A sudden crash echoed through the garage, startling him so badly he nearly dropped his wrench. He spun around, heart racing, searching for the source of the noise. At first he saw nothing, but then movement caught his eye near the back door. Two figures emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by black masks. They moved with precision, their boots thudding heavily against the concrete floor. Ethan's stomach dropped. This wasn't paranoia anymore. These men were real, and they weren't here for car repairs. "Well, well," one of them said, his voice low and menacing. "Looks like we found our guy." Ethan took a step back, gripping the wrench tightly in his hand. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to sound brave. "What do you want?" The second man chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "You know exactly what we're here for," he replied. "Where is it?" Ethan blinked, confused. "Where's what? I don't know what you're talking about." The first man stepped closer, pulling something metallic from his belt. A knife glinted in the light, its blade sharp enough to make Ethan's blood run cold. "Don't play dumb," the man growled. "You've seen it, you've touched it, now tell us where it is or things are going to get messy." Panic surged through Ethan's veins. He didn't understand what they were talking about, but he knew one thing for sure. These men weren't bluffing. Adrenaline kicked in, sharpening his senses. Without thinking, he swung the wrench with all his might, catching the nearest intruder off guard. The man stumbled backward, cursing loudly. The other attacker lunged forward, grabbing Ethan by the arm. They grappled fiercely, knocking over toolboxes and scattering equipment across the floor. Ethan fought back with desperation, using every ounce of strength he had. He managed to land a solid punch to the man's jaw, sending him reeling, but there were two of them, and Ethan was outnumbered. One of the men recovered quickly, shoving him hard against the wall. Pain exploded in his side as his ribs collided with the unforgiving surface. He gasped for air, struggling to stay upright. "Enough of this," the man with the knife snarled, advancing again. "Tell us where it is or we'll take it from your corpse." Ethan's mind raced. Whatever it was, these men weren't going to stop until they got it. And if he didn't give them something soon, he wouldn't survive the night. Then, it hit him, the device. The strange gadget he'd discovered days earlier while fixing a wrecked SUV. It hadn't made sense at the time. It looked like nothing he'd ever seen before, humming faintly with an energy that seemed almost alive. He'd stashed it away in a toolbox, figuring he'd figure it out later. Now, staring down the barrel of a knife, he realized he might not live long enough to solve the mystery. Summoning the last reserves of his courage, Ethan pointed toward the far corner of the garage. "It's in the red toolbox," he shouted, hoping the lie would buy him some time. "Over there." The men hesitated, exchanging a glance. For a moment, Ethan thought they might fall for it. But then the second man smirked. "Nice try," he said, tightening his grip on Ethan's arm. "We already checked the toolbox. Try again." Desperation clawed at Ethan's chest. He needed a way out. And fast. Spotting a crowbar lying nearby, he kicked it toward himself, catching the men off guard. With a swift motion, he grabbed the tool and swung it with everything he had, forcing them to retreat momentarily. Seizing the opportunity, Ethan bolted for the exit. His legs burned as he sprinted across the garage, dodging obstacles and praying he'd make it to the door in time. Behind him, the men shouted curses, giving chase. He reached the doorway just as one of them lunged, barely managing to slip outside. Breathing heavily, Ethan slammed the door shut and yanked a heavy chain across it, securing the lock. It wouldn't hold them forever, but it might give him a few precious minutes to escape. Leaning against the wall, Ethan pressed a hand to his side, wincing at the pain radiating from his ribs. His body ached and his clothes were torn, but he was alive for now. More importantly, he finally understood the truth. The device he'd found wasn't junk. It was dangerous. Deadly, even. And somehow, it had put a target on his back. As the sounds of pounding fists echoed from inside the garage, Ethan knew he couldn't face this alone. He needed help, but who could he trust? Detective Marsden had laughed him off earlier, dismissing his concerns as paranoia. Would anyone believe him now? One thing was certain: Ethan couldn't run forever. Sooner or later, he'd have to confront the truth, and the people hunting him. Until then, he had no choice but to keep moving, one step ahead of the shadows closing in around him. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled through the dark, narrow streets of the town. His body ached from the fight at the garage, and every step sent sharp jolts of pain radiating from his bruised ribs. The adrenaline that had fueled his escape was fading fast, leaving him feeling hollow and exposed. He knew the men wouldn't stop chasing him. They were too determined, too ruthless. But where could he go? Who would believe him? The answer came to him like a flicker of hope in the darkness. Detective Marsden. Sure, the cop had laughed him off before, but Ethan didn't have any other options. If anyone stood even a slim chance of helping him make sense of this mess, it was Rick. Clutching the strange device tightly in his hand, Ethan made his way back to the precinct. Each step felt heavier than the last, not just because of his injuries, but because of the weight of what he carried. This small, humming gadget wasn't just some random piece of junk, it was the key to everything. And if Ethan was right, it might also be the reason people were willing to kill for it. When Ethan arrived at the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unforgiving glow on the worn furniture and cluttered desks. Rick was still there, slumped over paperwork with a look of mild irritation etched onto his face. He glanced up when Ethan entered, his expression shifting from annoyance to surprise, and then concern. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," Rick said, standing quickly as he took in Ethan's disheveled appearance. "What happened to you? You look like you got into a boxing match with a truck." Ethan winced as he lowered himself into the chair across from Rick. "It's those guys," he said, his voice hoarse. "They came after me tonight. 2 of them. They broke into my garage, attacked me. They're looking for this." He placed the device on the desk between them. Rick stared at it, his brows furrowing. It was about the size of a shoebox, metallic and sleek, with blinking lights and faint hums emanating from within. To anyone else, it might have looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. But Rick wasn't easily impressed, or so he liked to think. "What is it?" Rick asked, poking at it cautiously with a pen. "Some kind of high-tech gadget?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "I found it while fixing a car a few days ago. At first I thought it was just weird junk, but now—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Now I think it's why they're after me. Those men. They weren't messing around. They wanted this thing bad enough to break into my shop and beat me half to death." Rick leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan carefully. There was no trace of laughter this time, just a quiet intensity that suggested he was finally starting to take the situation seriously. "All right," he said slowly. "Let's say I believe you. What do you want me to do about it?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how to phrase his request without sounding completely insane. "We need to figure out what this thing is," he said finally. "And we need to find someone who knows more about it than we do. Someone smart. A scientist or, I don't know, an expert." Rick rubbed his temples, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. "You realize how crazy this sounds, right? We're talking about shadowy figures breaking into your garage over a glowing box. That's not exactly standard procedure for a Tuesday night. I know how it sounds, Ethan replied, his voice firm despite the exhaustion in his eyes. But trust me, detective, this isn't paranoia. This is real. And if we don't figure out what this thing is, people are going to get hurt. For a long moment, Rick didn't respond. He stared at the device, his mind racing. On one hand, this whole scenario was absurd, like something out of a spy thriller. On the other hand, Ethan's battered face and the desperation in his voice were impossible to ignore. Finally, Rick sighed and nodded. Okay, he said, grabbing his coat. Let's see if we can track down someone who knows what the hell this thing is. Their search led them to Dr. Lena Hart, a reclusive physicist known for her work on experimental technologies. She lived on the outskirts of town, in a modest house, surrounded by towering trees and overgrown bushes. When Rick and Ethan knocked on her door, she answered cautiously, peering at them through thick glasses. Yes? She asked, her tone guarded. Rick flashed his badge. Detective Marsden. Sorry to bother you, ma'am, but we need your help. This man, he gestured to Ethan, who held up the device, found this, and we're trying to figure out what it is. Dr. Hart's eyes widened as she caught sight of the object. Without another word, she ushered them inside, closing the door firmly behind them. Her living room was cluttered with books, papers, and half-finished projects, giving it the air of a mad scientist's lair. She took the device from Ethan, turning it over in her hands with a mix of fascination and dread. Where did you find this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. In a car I was repairing, Ethan replied. Why? Do you know what it is? Dr. Hart nodded slowly, her expression grim. This is a prototype quantum destabilizer. It's designed to manipulate matter at a molecular level. In theory, it could be used to create energy or destroy entire cities. Ethan and Rick exchanged stunned looks. Destroy cities? Rick repeated, his voice incredulous. Are you serious? As a heart attack, Dr. Hart said, setting the device down carefully. If activated improperly, it could unravel matter itself. It's incredibly dangerous. How did you end up with it? I told you, Ethan said, running a hand through his hair. I found it in a car. Some SUV that came into my shop. I didn't think anything of it until those men showed up. Dr. Hart frowned, pacing back and forth. This explains a lot. A few months ago, there were rumors about a rogue faction within the military developing advanced weapons. They must have stolen this during transport. Whoever has it now, they're playing with fire. Rick let out a low whistle. So we're dealing with military-grade tech and whoever stole it. Great, just great. And they'll stop at nothing to get it back, Dr. Hart added, which means you two are in serious danger. Ethan swallowed hard, glancing at the device as if it might explode at any moment. Is there a way to disable it? He asked. To make sure no one can use it? Dr. Hart hesitated. There might be, she admitted, but it won't be easy. Disabling a device like this requires precision and access to specialized equipment. If you're serious about stopping them, we'll need to move quickly. Rick looked at Ethan, who nodded resolutely. Despite the fear gnawing at him, Ethan knew they couldn't walk away now. Too much was at stake. All right, Rick said, squaring his shoulders. Let's do this. But if we're going down this rabbit hole, we're doing it together. No heroics. No lone wolf nonsense, got it? Ethan managed a weak smile. Got it. As they left Dr. Hart's house, the weight of their mission settled heavily on their shoulders. They were in over their heads, facing forces far beyond their understanding. But one thing was clear. Backing down wasn't an option, not anymore. The plan was simple, or at least as simple as it could be when dealing with a weapon capable of unraveling cities. Armed with Dr. Hart's guidance and makeshift gadgets cobbled together by Ethan, the unlikely trio prepared to infiltrate an underground facility hidden beneath an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with tension as they stood outside the rusted gates, staring at the crumbling structure that loomed ahead like a tombstone. Rick adjusted the strap of the duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Inside were tools, flashlights, and a few items Dr. Hart had insisted they bring, things she claimed might help them disable the destabilizer. He glanced at Ethan, who looked pale but determined, gripping a wrench like it was his only lifeline. Despite everything, Rick couldn't help but admire the man's grit. A week ago, he'd dismissed Ethan as just another paranoid mechanic. Now here they were, about to dive headfirst into what felt like a scene straight out of a movie. "You sure you're ready for this?" Rick asked, keeping his voice low. Ethan nodded, though his hands trembled slightly. "No," he admitted, honestly. "But we don't have a choice, do we?" Rick smirked despite himself. Fair point. The entrance to the underground facility wasn't hard to find once they knew where to look. Hidden behind a pile of discarded machinery was a heavy steel door, its surface corroded but still sturdy. Rick pulled out a crowbar, wedging it into the gap between the door and its frame. With some effort and a lot of grunting, they managed to pry it open, revealing a dark staircase leading downward. The descent was eerie. The walls were damp, the air cold and musty. Every step echoed loudly, making them flinch at every sound. Flickering lights hung from the ceiling at uneven intervals, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the concrete walls. It felt like stepping into the belly of a beast, one that might swallow them whole if they weren't careful. "This place gives me the creeps," Rick muttered under his breath, clutching his flashlight tightly. "Imagine living here," Ethan replied, dryly, trying to lighten the mood. His attempt at humor fell flat, but it earned him a small smile from Rick. As they ventured deeper, the tunnels grew narrower and more labyrinthine. They passed rooms filled with strange equipment, banks of monitors displaying incomprehensible data, racks of weapons lined up neatly, and tables cluttered with blueprints and notes. Whoever these people were, they weren't amateurs. This was a well-organized operation, funded by someone with deep pockets and dangerous intentions. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor, freezing them in their tracks. Rick held up a hand, signaling for silence. Peering around a corner, they spotted two guards clad in tactical gear, their movements precise and mechanical. These weren't ordinary thugs. They were professionals. "We need to take them out quietly," Rick whispered, pulling a taser from the duffel bag. "If they sound the alarm, we're done for." Ethan hesitated, gripping his wrench tighter. "I'm not exactly trained for stealth missions," he said nervously. Rick gave him a reassuring pat on the back. "Just follow my lead. Stay close, stay quiet, and let me handle the heavy lifting." Creeping forward, Rick moved with surprising agility for someone his size. He darted behind the first guard, pressing the taser against the man's neck before he could react. The guard collapsed silently, and Rick caught him before he hit the ground, lowering him gently to avoid making noise. Ethan watched in awe, realizing for the first time that Rick wasn't just a desk jockey. He actually knew how to handle himself in a fight. The second guard turned at the faint rustle of movement, but Rick was faster. Before the man could raise his weapon, Rick delivered a swift blow to his temple, knocking him unconscious. Ethan hurried over, helping drag the bodies into a nearby storage room. "That was intense," Ethan said, wiping sweat from his brow. Rick grinned, though there was no humor in it. "Welcome to the big leagues, buddy." They pressed onward, navigating the maze-like tunnels until they reached a massive chamber at the heart of the facility. The sight took their breath away. In the center of the room stood the core mechanism controlling the destabilizer, a towering machine pulsating with energy, its surface alive with shifting colors. Wires snaked across the floor, connecting it to banks of computers and control, panels manned by technicians in lab coats. Standing near the machine was the man they'd been searching for, the mastermind behind the operation. Tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding authority, he wore a pristine military uniform adorned with medals and insignias. His face was sharp, his eyes cold and calculating. This was Colonel Graves, the architect of chaos. Graves noticed them immediately, turning to face them with a smug smile. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Look what the cat dragged in. A washed-up cop and a grease monkey. How quaint." Rick stepped forward, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun holstered at his side. But Graves raised a hand, and instantly, half a dozen armed guards materialized from the shadows, their weapons trained on the intruders. "Easy now," Graves said, raising an eyebrow. Let's not make this messier than it has to be. You, two shouldn't have come here. We're not leaving without that device, Rick shot back, his tone defiant despite the odds stacked against them. Graves chuckled darkly. You think you can stop me? Do you even understand what I'm trying to achieve? This world is broken, rotten to its core. Cities overrun with corruption, governments drowning in greed. Someone needs to cleanse it, and I'm the one to do it. You're insane, Ethan spat, his voice trembling with anger. You'll kill millions of innocent people. Innocent? Graves sneered. There's no such thing. Everyone's guilty of something, and sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good. Rick glanced at Ethan, silently communicating a plan. While Graves continued his monologue, Ethan began edging toward the control panel, hoping to find a way to shut down the machine. Rick kept Graves distracted, engaging him in conversation while subtly positioning himself to create an opening. You really think this is going to fix anything? Rick challenged. All you're doing is playing God, and trust me, nobody likes a guy who thinks he's better than everyone else. Graves' expression darkened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might snap. But then he laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down their spines. Enough talk, he said, gesturing to his guards. Kill them. Chaos erupted. Rick lunged forward, tackling one of the guards and grabbing his weapon. Shots rang out, echoing deafeningly in the confined space. Ethan dove behind a console, using it as cover while frantically working to disable the machine. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off metal surfaces, filling the air with smoke and the acrid smell of burning electronics. Despite the chaos, Ethan's focus never wavered. Guided by Dr. Hart's instructions, he began dismantling parts of the control panel, rerouting circuits and disabling safeguards. Each action brought the destabilizer closer to deactivation, but also closer to catastrophic failure. Graves roared in fury, charging toward Ethan with murder in his eyes. Rick intercepted him, tackling him to the ground. The two men grappled fiercely, trading blows as the battle raged around them. Blood trickled from a cut above Rick's eye, but he refused to back down. Finally, with a desperate cry, Ethan completed the final sequence. The machine sputtered, its glowing core dimming as the hum faded into silence. For a brief moment, relief washed over him, until he realized the feedback surge was building inside the device. It's going critical. Ethan shouted, panic rising in his chest. Get out of here. Rick scrambled to his feet, dragging Graves with him. Not without you, he yelled. There's no time, Ethan replied, his voice breaking. Go, please. Tears stung Rick's eyes as he hesitated, torn between loyalty and survival. But Ethan's resolve left no room for argument. With a final, anguished glance, Rick turned and ran, the sound of the machine's impending explosion echoing behind him. As the surge consumed the chamber, Ethan stood firm, knowing he had done everything he could to protect the world above. The light engulfed him, erasing his presence but ensuring that others would live to see another day. The explosion was deafening, a roar that seemed to shake the very earth beneath their feet. Rick stumbled out of the underground facility, his ears ringing and his body battered from the fight. He collapsed onto the cold, damp ground outside, gasping for air as smoke billowed from the entrance behind him. The acrid smell stung his nostrils, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, back in that chamber, with Ethan. He replayed the moment in his head over and over again. Ethan's face pale but resolute as he urged Rick to leave, the way his voice cracked when he said, "Go, please." And then the blinding light swallowing everything whole. Rick clenched his fists so tightly that his nails dug into his palms, leaving crescent-shaped marks. It didn't matter how hard. He tried. He couldn't stop seeing it. Graves was gone too, lost in the chaos of the collapsing facility. Whether he'd been caught in the surge or managed to escape, Rick didn't know. Right now, he didn't care. All he could think about was the man who had saved them all and paid the ultimate price. Dr. Lena Hart arrived moments later, her car screeching to a halt near the scene. She jumped out, her face etched with worry as she rushed toward Rick. "Are you all right?" she asked, kneeling beside him. Her voice trembled, not just from concern but from fear of what she already suspected. Rick nodded weakly, though the movement felt hollow. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "But Ethan, he didn't make it." Lena closed her eyes, pressing a hand to her mouth. Tears welled up, spilling down her cheeks. She had known the risks, they all had, but that didn't make the reality any easier to bear. "He stopped it," she whispered finally, her voice breaking. "He disabled the destabilizer. If he hadn't done what he did." Rick cut her off, his tone sharper than he intended. "Yeah, I get it, he's a hero. But heroes aren't supposed to die like this." Lena flinched at his words, but she didn't argue. Instead, she helped him to his feet, supporting him as they moved away from the wreckage. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Someone must have reported the explosion. Help would arrive soon. But Rick knew no amount of paramedics or firefighters could undo what had happened tonight. Back at the precinct, Rick sat alone in his office, staring blankly at the wall. His desk was cluttered with papers, coffee cups, and files, but none of it registered. The weight of Ethan's sacrifice pressed heavily on him, a burden he wasn't sure he could carry. For years, he'd prided himself on being a realist, someone who dealt in facts and evidence, not fairy tales about ordinary people becoming heroes. But Ethan had proven him wrong. Ethan wasn't a soldier, a scientist, or even a trained fighter. He was just a mechanic, a quiet, unassuming guy who worked with his hands and kept to himself. Yet when the world needed saving, he stepped up, without hesitation. He put himself in harm's way, risking everything to protect strangers he would never meet. And now, he was gone. Rick leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his hands. Memories of their earlier conversations flooded back, the laughter, the skepticism, the dismissive remarks. How could he have been so blind? So quick to judge? Ethan had come to him for help, trusting him to listen, and Rick had laughed in his face. That laugh haunted him now, echoing louder than the explosion itself. Outside, dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. Rick glanced at the window, watching the sunlight stream through the blinds. It should have been beautiful, a new day full of possibilities. But all he felt was emptiness. Later that morning, Dr. Hart visited the precinct, carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper. She placed it gently on Rick's desk, her expression somber. "This is for you," she said quietly. "It belonged to Ethan." Rick frowned, picking up the package. It was surprisingly light, almost weightless. Carefully, he unwrapped it, revealing a weathered notebook inside. The cover was worn, its edges frayed from years of use. Flipping it open, Rick found page after page filled with sketches, notes, and calculations. Some entries were technical diagrams of car parts, while others were more abstract, ideas scribbled hastily, half-formed thoughts captured in ink. "He always carried that with him," Lena explained. "Said it helped him think. After we figured out what the destabilizer was, he started jotting down ideas for disabling it. Turns out some of those notes were crucial. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to shut it down in time." Rick ran his fingers over the pages, feeling the texture of the paper beneath his fingertips. Each line, each sketch, told a story, not just of a man who loved fixing things, but of someone who saw potential in brokenness. Someone who believed that even the most damaged pieces could be made whole again. "I wish I'd listened to him sooner," Rick admitted, his voice thick, with regret. "If I had, maybe nothing." Lena interrupted gently. "What's done is done. All we can do now is honor his memory. Make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain." Rick nodded slowly, clutching the notebook tightly. He didn't trust himself to speak. The lump in his throat was too big. But he understood what Lena meant. Ethan's death couldn't be undone, but his actions could inspire change. They had to. In the days that followed, Rick threw himself into his work with renewed purpose. He reached out to federal agencies, sharing everything they'd uncovered about the rogue faction responsible for the destabilizer. Evidence was gathered, connections traced, and arrests made. Graves's operation was dismantled piece by piece, ensuring that no one else could attempt such a catastrophic plan again. Meanwhile, Lena dedicated herself to preventing future disasters. Using Ethan's notes as a foundation, she developed protocols for identifying and neutralizing dangerous technologies before they fell into the wrong hands. She gave lectures, wrote articles, and lobbied for stricter regulations, all in Ethan's name. The town began to heal, slowly but surely. People went about their lives unaware of how close they had come to annihilation. To them, Ethan Cole was just another mechanic, a quiet man who fixed cars and kept to himself. But to those who knew the truth, he was something more. One evening, Rick drove to the edge of town, parking near the spot where Ethan's garage once stood. The building had been reduced to rubble during the attack, but the sign, Cole's Auto Repair, still hung crookedly above the ruins. Rick climbed out of his car holding the notebook in one hand and a bouquet of wildflowers in the other. Standing amidst the wreckage, he looked around at the empty space, imagining how it must have looked in its prime. Tools scattered across, workbenches, engines humming softly in the background, and Ethan moving between projects with steady hands and a focused gaze. It was a humble place, unremarkable to most, but to Rick, it felt sacred. He knelt down, placing the flowers carefully on the ground. Then, opening the notebook, he flipped to a blank page and wrote a single sentence. "To the man who taught me that courage isn't about titles. It's about heart." As he walked back to his car, Rick glanced over his shoulder one last time. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape. In the fading light, the ruins of the garage seemed less like a tragedy and more like a monument, a reminder of the ordinary man who became extraordinary when it mattered most. And somewhere deep down, Rick smiled. Not because he was happy, far from it, but because he finally understood. Heroes weren't defined by capes or badges. They were defined by moments. Moments when fear took a backseat to duty. Moments when love outweighed self-preservation. Moments like the ones Ethan had, given them all.